morning. This is John Shear. I'm chairman of Proctors Historical Committee, and this is one of a series of interviews we're doing about Proctors history. Today is August 26th, 2013, and I'm talking to Karen Johnson. And Karen started off on City Council back in 1976, City Council for Schenectady. She was mayor from 1983 to 1992, I believe, and then she assumed a role here at Proctors. And what were some of your titles here, or what is your current title here at Proctors?
Well, currently I'm manager of planned giving, but when you mention all those dates, because I'm not very good at dates, but I was very involved. I lived downtown. I moved here in 1967, and I got very interested in downtown redevelopment. And I remember coming to Proctors to shows at that time when Mr. Matarazzo still owned the theater.
And what was the theater like at that time? Was it?
Well, it seemed about the same, to tell you the truth, and you didn't really notice the shabbiness of it, but there was an organization called Freedom Forum that gave a series of lectures.
Oh.
It was a voluntary organization, and so in amongst the movies that were being shown, there were things where you could come and watch shows and hear these lectures. And so I had been here, and it was a fixture of downtown, so when I became a councilman, I have this very clear memory of sitting in my Barca lounger with the TV in front of me, going through the in-rem foreclosure list. And about this time, there was an effort to redevelop the 400 block, which is this block where Proctors is. We've now renamed the Proctors block. And I saw that the theater was on the foreclosure list, and I said, oh my goodness, we have got to do something about this.
Now, do you remember what year that might have been?
Well, it was sometime around probably 1976 or 7.
Okay.
And then a whole bunch of things started in the community, and it wasn't that I started them, but they just started. And one thing was the Arts Council started having some meetings about whether they would like to be involved in Proctors. And a whole bunch of people started talking about, well, maybe the city would give it to us and so forth.
Now, who owned the theater at the time?
Mr. Matarazzo owned it. He was
Okay.
using it as a movie house.
But he couldn't make payments. He couldn't.
He wasn't. I don't
Yeah.
know what the situation was. And the city had not completed the foreclosure by the time I saw the list. That was just the list, and he could have come in and redeemed it, theoretically. He did not, and it transferred to the city's title.
And of course, a lot of this is symbolic of what was happening across the country with early movie houses and movie palaces. Television was taking a lot of the patronage away from the theaters. So, but evidently the city rallied because they were interested in doing something to save the theater.
Well, I think that the fact that in 1997, this group of people that were talking about the theater incorporated themselves as Arts Center and Theater of Schenectady, with the hope and expectation that if the city took the theater, they would be in a position to operate
You said
it.
1997. Did you mean
Excuse me, 77. It's that old date stuff, John.
Right. So 77 they incorporated.
Right.
And did they have an objective? What was their
Well,
first?
As time progressed, they decided to have the experimental season, and that started with the Blackstone show in January of '79. And it's kind of, and the rest was history. And so a lot of that has been really covered by people who were more involved in it than I was.
Now, who were some of those people who were instrumental?
Well, key people: Kay Rosendahl, Dennis Madden, the president of SCCC, Bob Larson, the president of the Arts Council, Marilyn Knoll.
Okay.
There were many more. Melvin Mintz, who was very active in the 400 block organization. Bob Cohen came in because their bank, which was Northeast Savings, or the successor to Schenectady Savings Bank, was going to be the financier of the development project.
Mm-hmm.
And he was loaned kind of to this corporation to do some legal work for them. So there were a ton of people involved.
And how did they organize themselves? I mean, who was the first CEO here at
Well,
Proctors?
the-
How did they get that into operation?
The first actual CEO was Philip Morris, but the first employee was Mary Ann Lamell.
Okay.
And there may have been some backstage workers. The memory that I have, though, is that the strongest force that was able to get this advanced was Kay Rosendahl. Now, Kay Rosendahl was the sister of William Scranton, the Scranton family of Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Oh.
The brother was a senator. And so Kay had a lot of influence. She was on the advisory board of Key Bank.
Okay.
And she had entree into a lot of places that perhaps others didn't.
Probably knew a lot of people too.
She knew a lot of people and was very well regarded. And she also, you know, there are stories which I've never seen but heard, that when they had something at the theater, she was paying the stagehands right out of her pocket, because this theater has had a history of needing money. It didn't stop either.
Always. And that's where your position is critical. You've been in charge of development over the years.
Since '93, I've been involved in some level of fundraising here. And what I find is interesting about that is that most people just love this theater. And I think the community grassroots development that it had, and the inclusion and the personalities of Dennis Madden, who was a great marketer, Gloria Lemaire, who was an extremely warm, talented woman, and then after that, the reach that we developed through the Harry Apkarian board, and then Philip Morris. It's been quite a ride.
Yes, I've been around for part of that ride. I remember all of these personalities you talked about. Dennis Madden was here when I got involved with the historical committee,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember him quite well.
Now, do you remember Billy Pemberton's
Oh,
name by any chance?
Do I remember Billy? Yes.
Well,
Talk about a flamboyant personality. She and I just hit it off from the start. She was the chair of the historical committee, and that's when I became
well, let me tell you
involved.
another part of her. In the early days of Proctors, we were a big volunteer operation. I mean, there were volunteers that were running the children's plays and many, many other things. Well, Billy was in charge of selling ads for the playbill, which was a very important stream.
Mm-hmm.
And Billy was great at selling, but she didn't like getting the ad copy back and doing all those things. So you know her and you would understand.
Yes.
So I became a volunteer here, working behind Billy and making sure that all the ad copy got in so we could print the ads.
Oh.
And it was a very good team we had, because I didn't like selling the ads. So we did it, and we had, those were the early playbills, were all managed by volunteers.
Wow. Wow. That's
And a lot
amazing.
was,
Mm-hmm.
a great deal.
Wow. So you actually came on board here in '93, you said? 1993?
Well, I can't quite remember. I began working here. I was on the board in '88, '89, and I'd been there for a while. The thing is that I was also at the critical meeting where the Harry Apkarian board took over from the old board.
Yes, what happened there? I know one day I came here and Dennis was no longer in charge of things, and I met Harry Apkarian, who was the new director of the board, and he sort of ran things for a while. Was there a critical time there when the theater might have gone under?
Well, there have been many times like that, and the public has always risen to the occasion. But on this occasion, what happened was that the theater had a great deal of debt, and cash flow was suffering. And Betty Apkarian was a member of the board, what I'd call the community board. Was mostly arts people, though there were a few others. Very dedicated to the community, but perhaps didn't have the clout that we needed to really turn this around. So that board began to talk about, well, what could we do to save ourselves financially? And Betty, meanwhile, was talking to Harry every day. Harry, you've got to help. You can do this. And so Harry and Ernie Kahn, who was then the president of the board, had some conversations I was not party to. And they came up with the idea that they would substitute in a new board for the community board. And the community board felt, like, we don't want this to go under, we'll do what we need to do. So there came a fateful night, and it must have been in 1989, and we all gathered at Ernie Kahn's house on Chestnut Lane in Niskuna, and Ernie kind of laid it out. And Harry was there, and they said, here's what we want to do. We want to put this other board in temporarily, and we'll see if they can help us get things back on track. So that was voted that very night, and Harry came in, and he brought in some extremely influential people to the board, including Bill Dake, Robert Freihofer.
Along with some money, too.
Yes, and Louis Golub, Ken Lally. Ken Lally had already been on the board, and he was very interested in Al Lawrence. And David Lynch from WRGB was an advisor. Joe Lyons, the publisher of the Times-Union. Russell Knoll from GE. And Ken Peterson, who was then president of Schenectady Chemical, which became SI
Some really
Group.
heavy hitters.
Very heavy. And they came in, and one of the first things they did was to really look at the finances. And they did make a change in management, and they brought in Don Shane.
There's a name I forgot about, that's right.
And Don had just retired from WMHT, and he was there really for a transitional period. And the brilliance of what he did was that he looked at all the debt, and he said, what we're going to do is we're going to ask people to forgive a third of it, to take a third of it in tickets, and we'll give them a third in cash. And by doing that deal, he was able to get us pretty well back on a stable course.
Okay.
And he also brought Gloria LeMaire in and Fred Daniels, who'd worked with him at Channel 17. And both of them had had considerable Fred in marketing, and Gloria was one of the first women in New York State to run a theatrical production, the Colony Coliseum.
Oh, she ran the Colony Coliseum, okay.
So she was very good at negotiating, and Gloria was here really until her death.
Yes, and Dan wasn't here that long. He was only here for a couple of years until Gloria came on. Is that correct?
Don never intended to stay that long.
It was sort of a bridge.
But he did, and he did a great job. And then Russell Knoll, who was the VP at Schenectady GE, got a whole bunch of GE auditors to come in here and really drill down on what was the situation as far as the finances. So everyone had a very realistic view. And at one time, some of these individuals that I mentioned loaned money to the theater, and the idea was that if we can pay them back with quite modest interest, that we will prove that we can be stabilized in our finances.
And when did you feel that the theater was back in the black?
Well, it's very hard to remember a date around that, but I know that when Gloria was here, we had at that time, we didn't usually have week runs of Broadway. They'd usually be what were called splits,
Yes.
and you'd share them with another theater,
Oh.
share a week.
Okay. Okay.
And when Gloria was here, in the later years, I remember years when we had 8 or 10 sold-out houses. And we actually generated surpluses in those years.
Okay.
So, you know, the money's been like this.
And I sort of remember the productions you were getting were more current and I think probably more attractive to the public too.
And so after a while, though, in Harry's administration, we did have an individual come in and talk to us about expanding the stage.
Oh, really?
And this was quite a while before we did it. But the board looked at his report, listened to him, and said, you know, we see the benefit of this, but I think he said it would cost about $12 million, and they just didn't see that would happen.
Now, Gloria passed away, do you remember what year?
No, I don't.
And then the next person to arrive was actually Philip Morris, right? Or,
Right.
Fred, I think.
Fred was an interim director.
Right.
And then Philip came, and Philip's been here 11 or more years.
And has done amazing things.
Totally.
I mean, who would believe that you would have been able to raise the amount of money that you did to make all of the changes here?
So I was the first person at Proctors to meet him because I was assigned to have lunch with him while they interviewed someone else. And I don't remember what my first impression was, but he was very interested in many things.
Okay. Well, I met him shortly after he arrived because the Association of Public Historians was meeting at Schenectady, and he came to speak to us, and we toured the theater at the time.
Now, I remember another occasion when we accepted the organ from the Golub family, and we had the famous organ concert.
When was that?
Good question. I have.
That was a while ago.
I
Because
think that could be documented because there was a book that we all have, a commemorative book.
Yes, the historical committee helped put
unfortunately
that
didn't
together.
look it up, but I had to go out on stage as mayor and thank the Golubs for the organ. So the things are moving along, and I remember going backstage, and I had my proclamation ready to go, and this woman who was working back there said, whatever you do, do not look at the lights because you will be blinded and you won't be able to read. So I, of course, dutifully followed her advice. And when you go on stage, most people don't realize it. You cannot see the audience.
I've been on stage for presentations,
this
and you're
blinding
right. It's crazy.
thing of light. So I'm not looking at the lights. I couldn't see anything anyway. And I'm reading away my proclamation. And then I have to say, and I hope the Golubs will stand up and receive our appreciation. And I had no idea where
Whether
they
were
were.
standing or not.
But I'm sure they were, and we certainly do appreciate the organ.
Yeah, people who have not been up on stage with those lights don't realize it. It's so true. You don't see a thing. You don't see anything out.
One
in the
other wonderful
audience.
night, the night of the opening when Blackstone was here.
Yes.
Kay Rosendahl invited the city council and the mayor to come up on stage, I believe at intermission.
Okay.
And she took the $1 out of her purse and handed it to Frank Ducey.
Oh.
To buy the
that.
symbolic dollar,
Okay.
because when you give something away, you have to pass something of consideration.
And I believe we have that dollar
I hope so.
in the history collection here at Proctor's. Yes.
So Frank Ducey is a person who saves everything. And many, many years later, Marty and he talked,
Mhm.
and they arranged for the dollar to come back to you, to
Yes.
Proctor's.
And we have it in the
And
museum.
hopefully we frame it or do something
Yes,
nice with it.
yes. Very. Just to go back a ways, what was Dennis's credentials? He was evidently local, right? He was
Dennis
involved.
was an early volunteer. He was a vice president of First National Bank of Scotia, very interested in the arts.
Okay.
And Dennis was vice chair of the first board. And what Dennis's wonderful skill was that he was able to communicate about the dream of this theater. He was a great marketing person. And he brought in some top-notch talent. I mean, all kinds of classical artists and so forth. And, you know, that's really how people started coming here.
Mm-hmm.
And developing this love of the theater. And I would say one of the most interesting things to me about who comes here is in the beginning it was mostly Schenectady people, and now it's transitioned to a very strong regional audience, where maybe Schenectady was 35 to 50% in the early days. It's now down to about 24%.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we have Albany, Saratoga. Well, the whole area has regionalized, so that shouldn't surprise me, but it is an amazing thing that we're now seen as a draw for Schenectady.
And I think the big draw of the theater, it's not like any other theater. It's history and its architecture. It's a gem in downtown Schenectady. And at a time when so many of these early theaters were being torn down, people came to the rescue of this theater and has preserved it. It is on the National Register of Historic Places, and again, it's one of the surviving movie palaces in the country.
I remember one of the impressions I had when I first started working here in '93 and '4 was that when you came to a show, it was the overwhelming beauty of the place. But when you looked around, there were a lot of flaws. There were a lot
the lights were low. So.
There was plaster that had been chipped, and you know, so the whole time that I've been here, we've been slowly renovating the theater. You know, we started with trying to get the ceiling painted, and that's been, well, at least 3 projects so far.
I remember when you, and that's gold leaf on the ceiling of this building, and you did that.
It's called Dutch leaf. It's
Dutch
not
leaf?
too much gold, but it's beautiful.
Yeah, it looks gold when you
It
get
looks
up close
gold.
to it. And I think that was done about 1992, as I recall. And I remember they put scaffolding up in the auditorium so they could work right under the ceiling. And they had to have it down by a certain date in September, as I recall, because they had to use the theater. They had programmed some things, and they were behind schedule, and they ended up working around the clock to finish it so they could get the scaffolding down.
Well, that's just what happens in a theater.
Right.
But the idea of that first job was to do the parts that had the major need for scaffolding. And then there was scaffolding up in the balcony area, but it was much less than we had when we did it downstairs.
And I understand that professionals train volunteers how to do some of the, like the scagliola, the fake marble, the faux marble.
That was another grant. And then we had air conditioning. I mean, we've been a partner with New York State Parks in historic preservation for a long time.
Which is wonderful.
We appreciate
Great
all their money.
Great source of funding, yes.
Well, and I think that we're just exactly the kind of place that they want to be supporting. Because we're a place where the public can come, and no matter what's on the stage, there's a certain experience of sitting in this historic theater that it doesn't matter what your age is. You just feel like it's a best behavior, great opportunity to soak in something that's just amazing.
And you're right about people now coming from out of town to see these productions, and it's always nice to hear their reactions to the theater. We see them come at intermission into the museum on the balcony level, and They have all these great things to say about how wonderful the theater is, and so it's.
So it took a lot of people to get that way, and it didn't just take one leader, it took many leaders. And to me, this is a wonderful story of how a community can come together and make something that's important to them happen.
And it has helped Schenectady. I mean, the economy here, I mean, it's sort of the focal point of the city. Brings people into the city, people spend money here, so.
All good.
All good. All good. Is there anything that we've missed?
No,
Karen?
I think we've covered a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.